On this afternoon, we're trying to think locally, nationally, and globally, and perhaps with a more local focus now. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Barney Horton. Barney is, if I can be so bold as to refer to him as a local food hero, I hope he'd accept that term. He's a chef, restaurateur, teacher, and food educator. And in 2011, he founded the Square Food Foundation, which has taught people from all backgrounds, of all ages and abilities, about cooking and better understanding the role food plays in every aspect of life. Barney also teaches food education studies at universities. He's lucky enough to in Italy and Sicily. Barney believes that food education should be playing a central role in health and education, and was awarded an MBE in the Queen's Birthday List for his community food education work here in Bristol. And he's going to tell us a little bit about a project he's been involved with at the Oasis Connaught Primary School. Barney, the platform is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, am I here again?
Perfect.
Okay. No, I was just sort of commenting on sort of following on from Karen is not is quite apt in a way, because I believe that food education is part of the solution to many aspects of poverty, and perhaps also maybe even the area of child deaths. So this presentation is going to give you a bit of history, slightly before Square Food Foundation came into being, and it will also contain perhaps quite a lot of stuff that most people already know about. And the reason I'm including it is because I use a version of this presentation to persuade schools, particularly heads of schools, and also other stakeholders in the world of education, why food education should be considered something that's a priority in the world of learning, from early years until young people leave school and beyond. So is it going to do it for me? Just a bit of context. This was a project I was involved in 1996. And it was a whole school approach to food education by the Royal Society of Arts and Waitrose and the Soil Association, which I was representing at that time. So in other words, this business of food education is not new in my thinking and in many people's thinking as well. And the missing link for me is policy engagement, as I hope I'll show. Again, I wrote this statement that from one person's relationship with the food they eat to global strategies for a sustainable world future, never has food education had a more important role to play in what it means to be human. And I wrote that in 2012. And the reason I quote it is partly because it's still, for me, a very important statement, if you like. That's what I believe in. But also, I think this use of the word human, as opposed to any other way in which you could describe food education, is that in the end, what food does at its most important, it brings us to a level of human sharing and engagement. So our mission is, as Matthew indicated earlier, is to teach people from all walks of life to cook good food from scratch. It's a lot more than that, as you can imagine. And in fact, I think perhaps some of the most important things that come into the work we do is around building trust, building hope, bringing life skills, confidence, empowerment, choice, health and well-being. And these are all words that come up a lot in any intervention where there are social or health issues. They're all quite common phrases, and I constantly look at them, trying to understand, are we delivering on those things? So we have changed the methodology with which we approach our work quite a lot over the last 10 years since Square Food Foundation began. We've keeping up with a changing landscape in particular, but also learning from each other and from other organizations how best to go about the work that we're doing. Perhaps, though, in the last 2 or 3 years, it's been my personal mission, and actually it's now reflected in how we approach our work, which is to get food education, particularly into schools, but also into the wider community. So for me, it's quite important to define what I understand, what I mean by food education, that it's not just about cooking and nutrition. And also, I think importantly, it's not just about poor people, even though that is the focus of our work, people in vulnerable people in deprived situations and so on. But for me, it's something that we all need to learn about much more. So that's why I've included all these subjects. And in amongst all that, whether you're at primary school or secondary school, it seems to me that given how important food is, it's the most important thing we do in our lives, is to put food in our mouths. It's a pretty immediate and a recognizable starting point for so many other subjects that children and young people learn at school. So here are some of the groups that come to Square Food Foundation. I won't dwell on them too much because I want to move on to the main point of what I'm talking about here. But suffice to say that we teach about 15 or 20 different programs, including team building workshops such as the one you can see here. And the reason I include this is because, and this is obviously pre-pandemic, when everybody's very relaxed in each other's proximity, is because what we are discovering is that one big missing thing among many of the children and the parents that we work with most closely is that they don't necessarily talk a lot about themselves or indeed about food. And we discover that through food comes the conversation that often is missing, and therefore conversations that can go somewhere in people's lives. And these are volunteers who work at Square Food. They're part of our economic model, if you like. We couldn't do without them, and I always think that's quite interesting to reflect on, given and we ought to be paying for people to come and help us set up classes, which is what they're doing. That's Charlotte in the background, who's writing on the board there, also setting up the same class. But a lot of it is about getting ready and making everything look lovely before people come in for a class. So everybody knows what food poverty is about, who's going to be attending this conference. And so I'm kind of stating something that people are quite familiar with, but it's specifically for me to do with what is not just a lack of food or a lack of a healthy diet. It's a whole lot of stuff behind it, which we already know about, the complex indices of deprivation, whether it's housing, unemployment, education, health, income, and so on. So we know all that stuff, and I believe that food education does play a really important role in addressing these challenges. So I should just say that this Healthy Schools profile that I refer to here is something that was done across Bristol, and many of you will probably know about it. I think there was due to be another one next year, or perhaps even this year. I can't remember. It's all got a bit lost in the pandemic. but it shows where Null West and actually where Oasis Connaught Primary School in Null West sits, which is not necessarily in a very good place, as you can imagine. So that's the challenge, and that's the reason about 4 or 5 years ago, I felt that the best we could do in our work was to focus on the whole school as a community and work with all areas of that school. I almost feel like I don't need to have any of this stuff, except you could say that you would think that by now, given these statistics that we're all familiar with, that we would have thought, well, how about putting food education higher up on the policy agenda within schools, within communities, within society in general? Instead of which it's left to organizations, of which there are many, and as you'll see as I progress with this presentation, they played an incredibly important role as the pandemic reached the UK. But it seems to me quite interesting anyway that that it hasn't been taken more seriously at government level. I'd be interested to know if anybody's got any reason answers to that question. That connection, if you like, between what happens on a global level and also on a local, what we're trying to do level of getting children to eat a better, more balanced diet. And you can see the similarity between the Eat Well Guide and the Lancet Commission picture of what we should be eating if we're going to have a healthier planet as well as healthier human beings. But it's also worth noticing, and I'm sure people, oops, I'll go back a bit, that it costs more if you are poor to eat a healthy diet. Obviously it does as a percentage of your income. So it's 73% if you're on universal credit. If you, £80 is what you really need to spend to eat a balanced and healthy diet. So it's out of many families' budget. And so the kind of food education that I'm talking about is not the total solution. It also requires greater spending at this level. However, here's what it looks like. It's basically working with all areas of the school, the teachers, the parents, and of course the children, establishing a school food charter at the school that they can work to. You'll see an example in a minute of a class charter done by the children, but critically also about putting food studies on the curriculum. And that's so easy at primary school level to do because the curriculum is very flexible. It's very open to themes, and in fact, it's quite common practice for teachers to take particular food themes anyway. And also critically measuring change. We do this in a very unscientific, unacademic way, but we have actually established a few models for how we do that. So moving from that healthy schools profile of 2017 towards something better, we hope. So here's a few images of the kind of stuff that goes on in Square Food Foundation. These, I don't need to comment on them. They speak for themselves, I think. Perhaps this is quite our mums. So this was just before the pandemic came along. It was actually just before Christmas 2019. And the reason why, there are two things I would say about this. One is that these mums, for the first time after a year and a half of working in them, came willingly, that they wanted to come, they wanted to understand what we were about and to learn themselves how to cook. And the other thing is that they're all mums, there are no dads, and that's always seemed to me an interest. Really important having teacher engagement, and of course people's lack of confidence in cooking isn't just among children and the mums and parents that we're working with. It's also among teachers. So we are teaching them how to teach cooking to the children in their schools, in their classes. Can you all still hear me? Oh, I hope so.
Yeah, we're hearing you. There was just a little shudder then, Bob.
Okay, good. So what makes this project work is having a dedicated and committed head of school, and also a food action team. And we are rolling this model out in other schools at the moment, and the prerequisites are pretty well those two things. You've got to have an active and positive and engaged team of people within the school, and that this team now includes children representatives from the classes as well. For me, this is one of the most significant images, if you want one, of what food education is about. One of the things that I teach the teachers is that if you hold a child's hand in the way that Nikita is holding Jerome's hand there, it's a really effective way of getting a child, or even an adult for that matter, to understand what he needs to do or she needs to do with his hands. And the other thing about this is that it's the mum who's learnt it from us, and now she's teaching her child, and also that he's very young, and you can't start young enough. This is a little example of a huge triumph of a class that decided, after they'd had a long conversation about it, what were going to be their goals. So I thought that was rather, it's brilliant. So anyway, that was all going on, and then of course March the 23rd came along, and along with it the pandemic. But perhaps, as with many organizations in the city and across the country, a lot of organizations like Square Food were kind of ready for it. We knew what we had to do. It was a very simple step in a way, even though it was hugely challenging. We ended up delivering 300 or 400 meals a day to families, 300 or 400 families, I should say. And that took a lot of organization, but we had the contacts. We knew that the school, we knew many of the children and the teachers, so we were ready. And critically also, as you all know, many organizations, many companies, restaurants and suppliers were willing and able to help. I feel like it's still there now in people, that this isn't something that was just there for the pandemic. I feel that it's now part of our model, that we engage much more with local suppliers and restaurants, and these chefs you see here still regularly come in to help us, and will continue to come as teachers and as helpers as well. So there's lots of meals in the middle there. On the right, you can see some recipe kits and a recipe. And this was a significant breakthrough for us. So from preparing and cooking and delivering healthy and actually really lovely meals for all these families, we now transitioned towards getting them to cook their own, but giving them the ingredients and the recipes, and also little videos for them to cook by. And that was a breakthrough. And I'm not sure if we'd ever been able to do that. It was almost gifted us by the pandemic, as awful as it was, and awful particularly for the family we're working with, for all the reasons that you know. But there they all were, and you can see the children here all cooking away at home. It was a huge step for us, for the school, for our relationship with them, and it was pretty good. Some statistics, that's what we sent out to everybody. Yeah, so it was very much a kind of a joint effort. It wasn't, we were working with the families and they were working with us, and it was a really simple and very sort of loving and positive relationship. As Matthew said, I got an MBE for it. And I mention this because I put this in because that gave us a lot of clout. Suddenly, in the middle of last year, or October of last year, I got this gong, and that was a good thing for us. So when I talk about evidence, it's not as scientific as perhaps we would like it to be. But we know that 350 families the families at Oasis Connaught are now cooking between 2 and 5 more meals a week from scratch than they were doing a year ago. And we know that because we're supplying much of the ingredients for what they're eating more vegetables, and their food varieties are more than they were. So there's a greater variety, particularly of things like pulses, and of course, vegetables as well. Significantly, children's conversations are really much more interesting. Their food choices as they talk about them are more varied. And parents' confident engagement, empowerment, advocacy. And actually, I was going to put in here activism, because they want to be part of a the food movement that is towards food education. They get it, and that's a huge step for us, and I think for them obviously as well. And so I mentioned at the beginning of talking about Oasis Connaught that we're dealing with the school as our focus. Well, the school, if you include parents and grandparents and siblings, is 2,500 people. I'm not saying that we've reached all those people, but I am saying that that it's a natural model for engaging with a community. It feels, and I feel perhaps in the future, I would hope that schools in general become more, especially primary schools, I think, more of a focus for what is a community. And I think
I'm going to jump in there, if I may, Barney, because I want to leave 5 minutes for some comments and questions from the audience. Is that a reasonable place to?
Oh, yes, it is. Okay. Yeah, I think it is.
No, please share your conclusion slide.
It was just so. I mean, I will say one other thing, that it's about policy change. We've done all we can. I don't think we've got any. We need funding. We need accreditation. We need Ofsted recognition, and so on and so on. And it's all about policy change. And I think that will do. There we are.
Thank you so much. I think in our opening session, Dave Gordon was reminding us of the really gloomy setback of the pandemic, really returning our SDG progress right back to baseline in 2015. You're suggesting that not all is doom and gloom out there, and if I can paraphrase you, there's something of a sort of reset you're hinting at, which sounds encouraging.
Yeah, I am very positive, and I, you know, even though sometimes it feels like an uphill struggle, I think it will be a long time before we get food education really embedded onto the curriculum and in school culture thinking. But we got to start, and I think there's the hope that it's going to become one of the recommendations on the National Food Strategy for a start, which I think is a good thing.
I'm just monitoring the Q&As here for questions from the audience, so please type them in as and when, because time is short. I was struck by your £80 a week figure. We were talking about destitution this morning with £100 a week total figure, which I found very striking, you know, that really to eat well, the family of four needs £80 a week. Yes, so there's...
Yeah. Yeah.
The role of the food banks in modern Britain?
Well, it's incredibly important at the moment, but I would have added that they're sticking plaster. They should not be in the equation really. It's obviously critical that they are, but I think it would be good if we could move on from them.
And I am sorry to say that the sort of food that one sees going into the food banks is not the sort of food you've just been talking about.
No, not for the most part. But yeah, it's getting better.
How do you hope to influence policy was the final question from Tom Allport. This comes on to the
we're doing it through a academy chain led food education campaign, but as I just mentioned, we've got a voice in the national, not just Square Food Foundation, but a number of organizations. We've got a voice on the National Food Strategy team, and they're considering putting food education as a recommendation to Parliament for the National Food Strategy white paper in November.
And there's a final comment from Professor Al-Niman. The problem affecting many families in deprived areas is access to healthy foods. Food Square's circumventing this by supplying ingredients. So that reset may be part of the key.
We need good shops in Nile West. We need proper shops. There's that classic food desert thing out there, and in many parts of the city as well.
And on that note, we'll have to leave it on the local initiatives. And thank you very much, Barney, on behalf of all the audience. I think that's been a really useful broadening of the perspective of today's session. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you.
Moving on, but staying with the local child health experience, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Tom Allport is a consultant paediatrician and honorary senior lecturer at the Centre for Academic Child Health here in Bristol. He works with children of forced migrant families in Bristol experiencing developmental difficulties as a clinician, which has led him to study the experiential and interactional worlds of migrant families in British cities and the ways in which place can shape activity and opportunity. So from this has emerged ideas and interventions which he has termed Find Your Village, to support those who come to the global north from cultures where it takes a village to raise a village, to raise a child. I'm sure Tom will now explicate that brilliant strapline. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks so much, Matthew. Am I heard all right?
I can hear you very well. And
brilliant, thanks so much. I'm relinquishing responsibility for the slides to Sarah. So Sarah, could you change one slide, please? Thanks so much. So children's early experiences affect their brain development and learning. Disadvantaged environments, poverty or whatever, in a broader sense, influence biological and psychosocial risk from fetus to adolescent, with widespread effects on brain and early child development. The effects involve multiple cumulative exposures, reciprocal effects, and spirals of disadvantage. Children from disadvantaged households have twice the risk of learning disability and are under a high risk of language delay. Next slide, please. Interventions to prevent this from before birth, if possible, are effective and highly cost effective. That quote is that the early intervention, early child development is the best way that the government can spend money to improve the future workforce. Next slide, please. Parents who migrate from cultures where it takes a village to raise a child may experience multiple challenges bringing up children in our atomized, fragmented society in combination with poverty and deprived environments. Children of migrants are at higher risk of delayed or abnormal development, especially if they're also experiencing poverty or disadvantage. Somalis represent the world's largest diaspora. Many Somalis have moved to the UK since 1990 due to conflict back home. 5% of Bristol's children are now Somali. Somali children in Bristol do less well educationally and are more often referred to child development and disability services. And our local epidemiology has found them 6 times more likely than their white peers to be referred for consideration of possible autism. Next slide, please. So as Matthew said, we've started on a journey to study the experiential and interactional worlds of migrant families in British cities and the ways in which place can shape activity and opportunity. These are the relevant features of effective interventions, integrating the understanding of what works for early child development and what works for migrants and refugees, and what works for place-based and environmental thinking. Next slide, please. In qualitative interviews, local Somali mothers have told us about multiple stressors likely to constrain children's play and interaction with others and contribute to social isolation. Very much contrasting with the sense of a supportive, connected community that they experienced in Somalia and East Africa. Next slide, please. We've called that paper Like a Life in a Cage, expressing the degree of limitation that life in a tower block in an urban city describes. We integrated findings from public and professional consultations, systematic qualitative and quantitative evidence reviews, and local qualitative research and epidemiology to construct an eco-cultural model of challenges to early child development in Somali refugee families. The model describes multiple interacting socio-cultural, economic and migrational vulnerabilities at family, community and society levels. Negative experiences of war, interclan violence and social breakdown in Somalia, loss of extended family and community relationships through bereavement and migration, traumatic personal experiences, relationship conflict and separation, and a sense of shame or stigma about these life experiences, as well as tremendously a lack of resources and difficulty negotiating the UK systems without extended family and community support, all combine to increase parents' sense of stress or risk of stress, trauma, loss, relationship breakdown, stigma and social isolation. Key mechanisms are likely to include the epigenetic effects of stress, trauma, discrimination and social isolation, as well as unconfident parent-child relationships and lack of exposure to pro-developmental activities in the absence of extended family and community support. So if back home the kids would play together and the parents would go out and play together and the parents would support each other, over here, if you miss out on both the Western, talk to your child, play with your child model and the do everything together because of isolation and stress, then the children don't get either way of getting through to their opportunities for play and interaction. Conversely, these families may offer very important messages about the advantages of communal or collective child rearing, which may really help improve family well-being and children's outcomes for the British and Western population as a whole. which is maybe especially important in the context of rapidly increasing rates of early child development problems, especially with social communication and autism. So we may have a lot to learn about ways of living together that we've thrown away over the past recent generations. Next slide, please. To hear about community assets and explore possibilities for environmental improvement, we undertook local neighbourhood walkabouts, dividing into small groups, parents, children, staff from city, university and voluntary sector, to join in critiquing how the local neighbourhood environment, next slide please, supports or inhibits play or interaction for children and families. So these are as an example of some local routes that we divided up and tried going around to critique the environment's opportunities that were offered. Next slide. And the children took photos, children and adults took photos of the best and worst of the world around them. I hope Matthew will appreciate the Abbey Road type photo on the bottom left, and asking questions about what could change. And these were shared with discussions and photo exhibitions with a wider range of stakeholders. Next slide. This has led to the city allocating 200,000 of what's called community infrastructure levy funding to improve the local parks. Next, please. We've taken this thinking forward recently in online workshops, Zoom workshops, using games, mapping, Lego model building and Photoshop to think together about wishes and needs for the local environment. So this is local Somali kids building the things that they think were needed in their local environment and then put onto pictures of the world around them so that they could see their ideas, if you like, taking root. Next slide. And we're currently exploring the potential for older young people from ethnically diverse backgrounds to become advocates and ambassadors for environmental change. Here's an example of their feedback about a local park, which is helping support a further application for community infrastructure levy. Next slide, please. With Somali community members co-designing, we've developed a peer support intervention that we've called Find Your Village to engage, support and enable Somali families with a child from before birth until 24 months of age. Somali peer support volunteers will provide weekly group activities and reach out to families on their doorsteps to help encourage, engage, advocate, support them solving their problems, and I think a continued approach of advocacy for improved local environments is another key element. Our aim is to increase families' sense of a supportive community around them, improve children's early opportunities for communication, play and interaction, and enable families to reach the services and resources they need, all with aim towards family well-being and child development, but is likely also to have effects on lots of other levels. Next slide, please. You can hear more about this on our short film, which again is Find Your Village, and in the version of this, I don't want to run it just now, thank you. In the version of this presentation that will be available after the conference, the website for that's available. Next slide. This isn't published, so I'm not trying to make this slide visible, but just to show there's a logic model or theory of change that's describing how the intervention is likely to produce changes at multiple levels that we expect to improve family well-being and early child development. This intervention, I believe, needs to be evaluated for effectiveness and cost effectiveness at improving well-being, development and life chances in families of refugees and disadvantaged migrants, and for its potential to disrupt cycles of disadvantage. We would like to develop a toolkit to show how the approach could be developed with other refugee or migrant groups and replicated across the UK. Again, as Barney, the aim is to inform policy and practice for informing national policy primarily in the early years and pregnancy from a health and education perspective, saying it's important to target and tailor interventions to disadvantaged migrant families. We've recently issued a policy briefing on this topic from the University of Bristol's Policy Bristol department, setting out some of the key aspects of policy change we're advocating. Next slide, please. Tailoring policy to disadvantaged migrants can have substantial impact. The UK has 8.5 million migrants, that's 13% of the population, including nearly 1 million aged 0 to 19. Over a quarter of live births in England and Wales in 2015 were to women born outside the UK, with over 100,000, that's 15%, from countries where child-rearing may be collective: Africa, Middle East, Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean, including 4,000 or 5,000 of Somali origin. Migrant women often have poorer health in pregnancy, with low socioeconomic status, chronic stress and healthcare access prominent as issues for that. One study found an 18 times higher neonatal death rate in African immigrants. I'm sorry I missed Karen Light's talk earlier to put some of the overview on those statistics. This field is an actively evolving area of government policy. You may have heard Andrea Leadsom having recently announced an early years healthy development review, saying they're working with the Treasury to make the economic case for investment. I think that's very clear, but has been not a recent priority, but I think hopefully will be having the no-brainer invest to save, as well as the human right aspect of this kind of work. And her review also noted poverty, poor housing and poor English as additional factors affecting children's outcomes. This fits very much with the new health and social care reorganisation into integrated care systems, with priority to address health inequalities, as well as local and national agendas about adverse childhood environments, and for evolving policy on social prescribing, which is something that's being rolled out in large numbers and large budgets, most particularly to address social isolation, loneliness and anxiety. And I would argue that social prescribing interventions very much also need tailoring and targeting to meet the needs of specific populations, and also that in context of poverty, it's not straightforward just to employ a link worker to signpost to community interventions or activities that are available, because those are going to be very unfairly distributed. And therefore the social prescribing model is likely to need to fund the activity as well as the signposting. Both social isolation and early child development difficulties are distributed with a high degree of social inequality, and those are likely to be worsened very much by the effects of COVID-19. So suggestions of ideas for funding to pilot the intervention. I think we're well down the road of intervention development, but I think would really benefit from a chance to provide proof of concept and to clarify the dosage, if you like, so how much intervention is likely to produce the gains in well-being and gains in confidence about child rearing, which is probably the best surrogate measure, the proxy outcome for early child development, which changes slowly. So suggestions about ideas to fund pilot would be much appreciated, but I'm hoping that we can put an application into NIHR for funding later this year. But a pilot beforehand would very much improve that process. Thank you very much for the audience, and interested to have questions.
So as always, questions are invited using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens, which I'm monitoring, and I hope I'll pick up your questions as they come in. Whilst you're considering that material, I'd like to ask Tom a little bit to reflect on the presumption that underlies this work, that child rearing in different cultures is a more collective enterprise than it is in the high income, more individualized Western setting. Is that true? And as a result, you're inferring we're losing something?
I think I hear such consistent feedback from people I talk with about that. I think clearly it's not an all or nothing or an apples and oranges situation. I think each of us, you know, my friends who bring up children, I think we benefit from village in our own way. I think that's why the Find Your Village is such a valuable idea, is that I think each of us need groups of people who we're able to share ideas with, get support from, think about what next with. And so how that's done is, you know, is as diverse as there are parents. But I think it's so, and I guess I think one of the most constraining things in that environment is fear. I think there are so many things that parents fear on behalf of their children, and I think what's so striking is that how much more powerful that is in a context of social isolation. That if I think about the urban myths that kind of constrain me or make me worry, or, you know, my professional experience in safeguarding or whatever it is that makes me worry about my children's situation, it's having friends to laugh at those fears in the context of, you know, a meal or a drink or a social gathering in some way. That's the place where I contain my fear about how my children may be, what might happen, what my choices are. And it's so striking that when you're isolated, you don't get those things. And the stories of, for example, Somalis, who I've listened to most about this recently, but not at all limited to them, that, you know, they describe if you have a problem, you can always find somebody who can tell you, you know, they've dealt with that government agency and they'll talk you through how to deal with it. Or, you know, quite often they'll come with you themselves to the office and say, you know, show you how you do it. People, if you live in a connected community, people will constantly share the responsibility with each other. The example that really captured it for me was when the muezzin calls for evening prayer from the mosque, all the children in a Somali village know that it's time to go home. And if an adult sees a child out after that time, they'll say, it's time to go home, mate. And that kind of collective responsibility, and equally that they describe if a child's lost or hurt, all the adults with them will feel able and capable and responsible to step in and say, can I help? Can I take you home? Even if I don't know who you are, I'll know somebody else that I can ask who maybe lives closer. And eventually they, you know, even in the middle of a war, the parents I've talked to have all felt sure that if my child got lost, they would be brought home. And in that network of safety and security means that the kids can go out and play and really have fun with each other in a way that our, helicopter alternative, I think, obviously there's lots and lots of strengths and resources about a Western environment, but it doesn't have the freedom to really interact with others in the way that we've really let go. I'm sure you may have seen, there's a fabulous newspaper article from Sheffield that took a 4-generation family of interviewed them about their 8-year-olds and their freedom to roam, and the great-granddad could go 6 miles to go fishing, and the granddad could go 2 miles to go swimming, and the mum could go half a mile to go swimming, and the then current 8-year-old was able to walk to the end of the road. And that was repeated as proper research kind of 10 years later, just around the turn of the century, and a good proportion of 8-year-olds weren't allowed beyond the front doorstep. So I think there's a huge secular trend in what we're doing, and I think we may be able to learn an enormous amount from other cultures who aren't so far away from it, while at the same time really responding to the need that arises if you come from that model to this one with lots of poverty and stress and trauma and whatnot. So social isolation and opportunity for social interaction feels like a kind of common pathway to lots of difficulty with well-being and child development.
I was struck in this morning's opening session by our colleagues from the Poverty Lived Experience Collective, calling for co-design of research from the beginning. It strikes me your project, as did Barney's, have high levels of participation of your clients from an early stage.
I hope so. I mean, that's been I feel like my partnership with the Somali collaborators is really strong, and it's so striking with what the quality of how safe I think they feel to tell it like it is, and also to encourage that with their own children. It's been thinking recently about how do you grow advocates, and what is it about the listening space that helps young people to know that their voices will be heard. It's not just listening, obviously, it's doing something with what you hear.
So these are two lovely examples, both yours and Barney's, of local initiatives which are very grassroots, and you're both, I sense, feeling there's lots of transferable learning that you're keen to get up into the national policy level now. And of course, we have an international audience today at this conference, and so good ideas spread.
Thank you.
I'm conscious that I've been occupying the microphone a little bit. We have the last 5 minutes if there are any particular points from the audience. The Q&A button is awaiting you. We are going to move after the break on to early child development in another context, in the African context, which will supply, I think, an interesting another dimension to this same discussion. Good. Well, I sense then that we're at a natural break point for our refreshments, and perhaps more importantly, a screen break, as we all get a bit goggle-eyed. So I do hope you'll be back to join us very soon. I believe at 4 o'clock for the final session. Sarah, is that?
That's correct, Matt. Yes, the final session is at 4 o'clock.
Lovely. Well, I'd like to thank all our participants for this early afternoon session, in which we've ranged from national and local issues around play, food and death, which kind of probably goes to the heart of it all. So I'd like to particularly thank our contributors and take a well-earned break from the screens, but I do hope to see you back here at 4 o'clock to hear from my co-chair, Maya Coley-Lynch, and Dr. Margaret Nampija from the African Population Health Research Centre, Kenya, on more deliberations around early child development. Thank you and take a break.